Greetings, this is Matt Field, your favorite unaffiliated and write-in candidate for governor of the state of Utah for 2024 of obviously this year. So I am essentially what I've explained in the past is my objective is to comment on various news that's taking place and what I believe should be happening, and also kind of delve a little deeper on the various issues that I discuss in my book/proposal, Morality Over Monarchy, Root Out Corruption, which is free. I'm not trying to make any money off anybody. It's literally my proposal of what I would do as governor. And you can find that at govmat.org, where you can download it for free. You can download the text or the audio, your choice. Or you can go to, I have a link in the description as well of that particular download, and you can listen to it on Rumble if you so desire. So one of the questions I do get that I've gotten a little bit more frequently, and I'm a little surprised by it, I guess not necessarily surprised by it, but I'm surprised at the way people react, is that why are you running as unaffiliated? And I have very specific reasons for that in the book that I lay out in great detail. But essentially it is that I believe that parties, much like Washington believed, they have essentially usurped power that is not theirs. They use money, they use influence, they use party leaders to essentially guide certain elections a direction that they wish them to go. The Republican Party, they receive money from outside the state that influences the state greatly. The candidates that are most well-funded are receiving funds from people that will not live under the laws that they are pushing here in the state of Utah. It's the same thing as if Russia decided to donate to any of the federal candidates running for any office in the United States right now. So I have a huge problem with that. I also think that people have kind of put on their party goggles and act like that it's their team, right? I grew up in Utah, and so my folks were Republican, and so I started off as a Republican. And for a while, when I would see news, come across, and they would say Republicans did this and Republicans did that, I'd always look at what it was saying and try and justify it somehow in my mind because they were my team. And it's the same thing with Democrats, or the same thing with any party. Whenever we see something come across, if you're a BYU fan or if you're a U fan, if something comes across, you justify whatever maybe bad action that they've had to be something good because they're on your side. And the problem is as we continue to pick sides and we continue to create this division, which there's already ample in our country and in our state, the greater and greater problems we will have. So that's the main reason. The reaction I've got has been surprising. I've requested to be included in various gubernatorial reviews, basically, of the Republican Party, and I was told that I could not participate. Even though I'm obviously a gubernatorial candidate, I'm a writing candidate, but I'm not a member of the club, basically. And so I'm prohibited from participating. Parties create exclusive clubs, and they create exclusion, right? Particularly in a public venue, public forum, that's inappropriate. Everyone that is running for a particular office should have equal ground so that people can make an evaluation that's appropriate. So that's one piece of when I talk about rooting out corruption, that is one of 7 different things that have to take place in order for corruption to be eliminated. And again, I encourage you to go to govmat.org to listen or read the entire proposal. It is very in-depth, and I think that it would be beneficial to everyone. Instead of just voting for your team, ditch the political process not necessarily ditch the political process, but ditch the political party that continues to kind of control you and push you in a way that you don't necessarily want to go, right? It's essentially an aristocracy that they've created, and we are the peasants that must obey the lords to move about in our government. right? So anyway, I'm going to move on to a little bit more on some of the issues that are taking place right now and some of the news things that I've seen come across that I think are quite valuable. One of them that I thought was a little bit strange, and I still think these sorts of things, is when the government decides to get overly involved with various things in the nation, or not in the nation, but in the nation too, but I'm referring more to the local government in Utah, is that the governor recently signed a bill to keep a large coal plant alive, okay? And this has got controversy and all this sort of thing happening because the governor is essentially allowed. First of all, why does the governor get to decide whether or not a privately owned coal company gets to continue to function? That is a massive question. If someone came along and you had a business and you had to get the government's approval to stay open, do you think that would be fair? It doesn't matter how much what that company, the fact that it's producing pollution and it's creating inversion and things like that, that is kind of irrelevant when it comes to private property. That is someone else's property, and the government doesn't have the right to come and take it or control it in any way whatsoever. It's one thing if you were taking it and intentionally trying to hurt people with it. Okay, that's when the government could probably come in and law enforcement could remove it because you're intentionally trying to hurt somebody. And now, granted, there is the argument that with the inversion and the pollution it creates, particularly in Utah, it's much more unusual just because of how it settles in the valley. But in reality, what should happen is the government, if they want something like that, if they want to control some level of inversion that's being created by this, they should go in with a partnership with that particular with this particular coal plant and say, hey, we have issues with inversion. We're willing to contribute X number of dollars if you will contribute with that as well to help reduce that by implementing these various measures. And most of the time, there are ways in order that we can do to reduce that pollution. But the government shouldn't be taking the time to actually regulate who can live and who can die based upon what business is popular and what is not, right? People have the right to start their businesses, and if they aren't actively trying to cater immorality to youth, most likely there's very little reason for them to be stopped, okay? So the next issue I kind of want to jump onto was the water issue. We always hear about water in the state of Utah, and I know before I jump a little bit farther into this, it took me a little while to begin to look at the issues in the state as something that is valuable and that deserved my attention. And if you're listening to this right now, you're probably thinking the same thing. Why should I take the time to be concerned about the local government and what's happening in the state? Well, first of all, obviously, it affects you directly. The problem is right now that we divert the attention of the citizen on trivial things, really, when it comes to our lives, right? So, for example, the whole world gets all up in arms when things don't go their way with the Super Bowl or March Madness or something happens with Donald Trump, of course, whatever the cause du jour is, everyone is losing their mind, and they're not actually paying attention to what is right in front of them. And it's not like we can't pay attention to some of these things, but the fact of the matter is that if the state actually exercised the 10th Amendment powers that it has, it could really disconnect itself from the drama and the serious nature and serious situation that the federal government has put itself in regards to debt, in regards to other policies. The only way that the federal government has the ability to do what it does right now with various states is the fact that it provides money to the states. And you'll see if you take the time to review my plan is that I actually propose to reject all federal funds because that is probably the most corrupt money that you'll ever receive because it's essentially Pinocchio strings. They want to control you in every which way that they can. And so this is what we have to do in order to, get over this problem. Anyway, so moving back to this water issue that takes place in Utah, that seems to be an ongoing thing. And if anyone has been following anything with the water, especially the last couple of years, you would know that we are doing great. We are doing really, really well when it comes to water. Lake Powell is up. Basically, Bear Lake is up. Utah Lake is up. I mean, basically, if you look across the board, there is so much water in the state of Utah right now because of all the rain and the snow that we've received. And so then you see articles that was recently published here on Fox 13 that talks about, should Utah change how residents pay for water? And right now there's not a massive, there's the argument is that the human beings that are using water to water their lawns or to take care of their daily needs need to pay more, or they need to pay it differently. They're trying to find a way to basically reduce the amount of water consumption. And the argument is that they want to contribute more to the Great Salt Lake. Now, why, again, and I've made mention of this before, why on earth are we having issues with water in the state? And we're having issues with water with the Great Salt Lake, but then we don't have issues with all these other lakes around. And again, the answer is very simple. The difference between the freshwater lakes that we have all throughout the state and obviously the Great Salt Lake is that it has the salt. And because of that factor, they mine lithium out of there. And so what Utah has done, I don't know exactly every detail on this, because they've actively tried to hide it, and the reporting on it has been spotty at best. But they're overmining, and so because of course everyone has to be in an electric car by 2030. That's obviously not a Utah policy, but a lot of states are pushing for it, California in particular, and the federal government's trying to push for it. And so they're literally saying we want people to use less water so we can contribute more water to the Great Salt Lake to save it, when we're just poorly managing the mining process that's taking place over there. The answer is stop mining so much, duh. And what is the issue with the water? Now, there might be, in places like southern Utah, there might be need for, because it's growing so quickly, there might be need for a pipeline of some sort that's going from the ocean. Desalination is extremely inexpensive, and that process could exist to where we're pumping more water that direction. And frankly, again, when we talk about, I'm going to jump into the housing situation here in just a second, but when we're talking about water in general, we do have issues in the South, and it seems like when it comes to expansion, we're just expanding for expansion's sake, rather than taking the time to more thoughtfully review that process and get things done. And I honestly, I think the government down in southern Utah is pretty disorganized, and they're poorly managed. And it's largely because people are more interested in the fun things than they are the reality of the situation. They're interested in putting together fun subdivisions and golf courses and doing all these different things, rather than actually getting down and dirty with the actual issues that confront us. And so, and I don't want to go too long on that, but if we go back, if we go from this water situation on to what's happening in the housing situation here in the state, is, the governor recently signed another deal with DHI. That's the stock ticker on them. I'm trying to remember what DR Horton. And publicly traded company, and everybody was praising him to some degree that they had signed another deal with DR Horton to come in and build more homes. And I find this so ridiculous, okay? And the reason I find this so ridiculous is because when things started to pick up, obviously we've seen an increase in price from, I think the median price was something like $250,000 before 2020, and then it's launched all the way up to $500,000, and I think that's kind of the average median or average price across the entire state. In the northern parts of the state and some of the more rural parts of the state, they've seen a tripling of the total cost for a home. Down in St. George, it's been doubled. Right? It's insane. It's insane the amount of increase that has taken place, and obviously you don't see those numbers on the CBO when they're calculating inflation. So it's kind of silly that that happened as quickly as it did, and that the only real solution that I saw, which is pretty ridiculous, is that the government comes forward and says, hey, what we're going to do, because all these first-time home buyers want to get into a home, we're going to offer an incentive of $20,000 so that we can push these various developers and builders to build homes that are around, I think it was $450,000 or something along those lines, which, by the way, is a crazy amount of money for a home in general, particularly when you look back, not even 5 years ago, right? That $500,000 or $450,000 would have gotten you pretty much anything you wanted. Unless you wanted, water slide and whatever else in your backyard. But in general, you'd basically be able to get whatever you needed, whatever you wanted with $450,000. Now today, the problem is now that the government has decided to do that, what does that do for the, especially since the market's a little bit slower because of the interest rate? The builders are starting to work more towards condo and apartment-styled homes rather than the traditional family homes that we've seen through the years. And they're doing it because they want to pick up on that incentive. And so what does that do? That creates more kind of R3 housing, packing people together, which, by the way, increases the amount of crime in various areas. And it, I think probably the biggest problem, the biggest issue that I have with it is that it is incentivizing first-time home buyers to jump into a market that they really shouldn't be jumping into. They're getting an extra $20,000, which is a drop in the bucket to a $450,000 price, and they're buying in a 7% market interest rate. And what does this do? Well, what this does is it creates a situation where back in the day when you'd buy a home for 2 or 3%, you were going to anticipate over the course of a 30-year loan you'd pay about double that amount. Now you're looking at 3 to 4 times that amount. So that $450,000 now goes from what you think is the face value of $450,000 over the course of 30 years is actually about $1.2 million. Okay, back in the day it would have been $900,000. Okay, but now you're way up because the interest rate and the overall inflation that exists, which is essentially twofold. One is that people are moving into the state at massive amounts, and then you have, of course, large capital firms or large capital and equity firms like BlackRock and Blackstone and other things that have purchased up massive amounts of 40% for crying out loud of the single family homes, and they've rented them out. And so this obviously has created scarcity. And so instead of actually addressing what the state is doing is silly. They're trying to, obviously there's a supply and demand issue here. And so we know that in its basic economics, if you want to lower the demand, you have to increase the supply. Or you lower the demand. Okay? In this case, the lowering of the demand is the easier part. You say, well, how is that possible? It's actually quite simple. It's very, very simple. We know the two culprits in this situation are out-of-staters that are buying up homes at a very, very quick rate, outbidding everybody that's in Utah because they've lived in a very, very, higher income state that has much higher living costs, and so they sell their house for $1 million, which is above kiss over there, and then they come over to Utah and they're like, yeah, I can pay $600,000, whatever, I'll have $400,000 left over. And so this is the situation we find ourselves in. And then we have obviously other people that are just moving out of the state because of regulations, because of COVID initially, but people are still making the move. People are still moving into the state at high rates, trying to get into Utah. And so, the government's genius plan is, hey, we'll provide a $20,000 incentive to get basically kids into the market that have very little money. They have very low track record. They're getting very, very high interest rate loans. And basically we're going to put them in a situation where they're going to default. I mean, let's be real. At some point, they're going to default. Someone making $50,000 a year, even if you have a dual income, you're $100,000 a year. The original standard was by 2.5 to 3 times the value of your annual income, which would have put you around, if you were making $100,000 a year, $250,000, $300,000, which was plenty reasonable. Now they're well beyond that, double that, and triple that in some areas, right? So the solution is you cut back the demand, and by cutting back demand, what you do is you tax these equity firms that are buying in. You tax them at a higher rate because we know that they're purchasing them for an investment purpose or to rent or whatever the case may be. And our objective is to even out the market. And we do the same thing with the tax on out-of-staters. We tax them on the price of their home. That money then goes into an endowment fund that pays for services, other state services, and other state investments, which could also be contributed to as an investment toward, the first-time home buyers. Now think of how gradually the market would have moved if we had done something like that. And think of how large of an endowment fund the state could have created to pay for future things and not have to rely solely upon taxes. And that's the other part. That's the other part that I've talked about, is how we are able to move from a tax-based society to an endowment-based. Okay, right now the government has to continue to tax the society in order to pay for all the things, right? Many of the things I know I don't take advantage of. The only thing that I use is basically the infrastructure. And I think that's largely the case with most people. On occasion, you might need a little extra help, and that help can still be provided. The problem is that many of these services are being taken advantage of. And I'll jump into schooling another time, but this is the transition that has to take place, and it can largely be done by just implementing these very simple things, taxing on the real estate of those that aren't in the state. Anyway, I can again go to govmat.org, and you can get the full version of what I'm kind of just laying out. And so I just wanted to kind of wrap up. I'm kind of going off on housing just because it's a pet peeve of mine that these certain things are taking place, and yet in all reality, the government has done nothing. They literally have done nothing in the process to help ease the problems that are taking place in the state when it comes to housing. And by the way, I'm one of those that has had that difficulty. Thankfully, I'm in a better position than most, but when I originally sold my home in 2020 of September of 2020, I found thinking that since the government was being shut down, I owning my own business didn't realize that people were getting gobs of money from the government, and they felt wealthy, and at which point they decided to start buying, and other people were saying, hey, we got to get out of California, we got to get out of wherever, and New York, and move to Utah. All these things were happening simultaneously, which just launched the market, of course. I was unaware of some of these things. But anyway, you buckle down and you make things happen to where you don't have to find yourself in a compromising position. Anyway, but what's happened is that the government has placed essentially people into a sort of slavery. And so this is what I want to lead into, kind of my finished point here, is I like to kind of end off on a little religious note. And Utah is the most religious state in the entire country, okay? And I think in many ways, probably the entire world, if you look at in groups of populations. And so I want to end on kind of a religious note here, and kind of a rebuttal to what many have said. I've heard Bill Maher, I've heard other leftists and liberals say that the Bible is basically a handbook to slavery, which couldn't be farther from the truth. Okay, and I'm going to use the housing situation that we currently have and the Bible slavery thing to kind of explain this entire process. Now, first of all, most of these people probably haven't even read the Bible, so if they'd taken the time to read the Bible and do just the slightest bit of study, they would realize what was taking place. Okay. In the Bible, slavery is used frequently, but it's not used as what we view it today. First of all, the word slavery comes from the word Slav. Okay, I believe it's in the 13th century or something around that time. I should probably just look it up here real fast. I'm pretty sure it's 13th century. I can't, with running the mic at the same time, I can't plug into my computer, but around the 13th century or so, prior to the translation of the King James Version of the Bible, they had the word slave, and so they used that in the translation. It basically is kind of an improper word for that process. Because what happens in the Bible is they call it slavery and they call people masters, but essentially what they're saying is the bank and the whoever you call the person taking out the debt-ee, right? And so a good example of that is Abraham, right? He worked 7 years to marry Rachel from his father-in-law Laban, and Laban tricks him, of course, and he marries Leah, and so he has to work another 7 years to finally marry Rachel. And in Judaic law, the maximum amount of time in which you could be held in quote-unquote slavery or debt or mortgage was 7 years. And so you can kind of see how Laban really was messing with him, because he made him do the maximum that he could do under Judaic law, and that's why he held him under slavery for that amount of time. Or debt, again, would be the proper word for that. And if you look throughout Genesis and throughout Exodus and various others, Leviticus is very, very detailed in some of these things. If you want to take the time to review that, it does talk about that. Now, of course, in Exodus, when the Egyptians decided to kind of take over and take on the Hebrews, they pervert the concept of quote-unquote slavery, and they basically enslave them or make them indebted to them for life, right? And they kind of they pervert that concept. Again, slavery is the wrong word. It's not, I don't believe it's the right translation. Again, that slave word came from Slav in the 13th century or so and was used in the King James Version. But in all reality, I don't believe that is the correct translation, because if you look at the transactional nature of slavery of that time, it was 100% debt to bank to dettee, that process. So right now, what we are doing essentially is we are placing ourselves, those that are taking out mortgages at high percentage rates, we're placing ourselves under an oppressive, a very oppressive slavery in ways, right? Because all you do, many people living paycheck to paycheck, and I think it's 50+% now. I think we're up to 60% of nation's population are living paycheck to paycheck. Could be higher than that. Last study I read said 60%. We are literally working to pay the bank, right? And who owns the bank? Who owns the money, I guess, is what really is the word, and is the Fed, right? And they continue to inflate that currency by printing dollars because the irresponsibility of the federal officials that we currently lay our trust. I hope we don't lay our trust. But I encourage you all that if you haven't been looking at politics in the local sense with a more critical eye, then you need to take the time. Because if you don't, you're going to find yourself in positions that are going to be extremely compromising, are going to prevent you from fully enjoying your life. And we do need to elect officials that understand these simple principles and that can actually put us in a much stronger position as a state by saying no more to the federal government, by implementing measures like the one I suggested, taxing high equity and capital firms that are purchasing up properties and taxing out-of-staters that move into the state. This would drastically decrease the demand on the homes and slowly bring down the pricing of that currently exists in the state. And it's such a no-brainer that I don't understand why nothing has happened in this way. And which just again leads me to believe that, much like I've discussed in my book, that corruption is rampant, not just in the federal government, but throughout every government and every crevice that you can find in the state and other states. And that's why we have to do our very best to root out corruption. We have to focus on morality over monarchy, or we will find ourselves, we are already on the cusp of being on a full-on monarchy, and we have to be aware of that. So take the time. Please read or listen to my book. People listen to podcasts every day. All day, every day is what I meant to say. So please take that time, read it, listen to it, and then decide. Thank you.